When Margaret Thompson hired a young African woman to clean her Beverly Hills mansion, she never imagined she was humiliating the future judge who would decide her family's fate. How did a domestic worker manage to completely reverse a situation of racism? And why did American justice reserve such a poetic twist? This is the story of a young immigrant who transformed humiliation into determination and proved that education can be the most powerful form of revenge. In 2018, in the hills of Beverly Hills, California, Amara Johnson arrived every day at 6 a.m. at the Thompson mansion. Margaret Thompson, heiress to a real estate fortune, made sure to remind her daily that people like her should be grateful to have work. What the racist millionaire didn't know was that Amara was studying law at UCLA during the nights, financing her studies with her salary as a domestic worker. While cleaning the 15 rooms of the mansion, Amara memorized legal codes and dreamed of the day she would wear the black robe. The daily humiliations, from being forbidden to use the guest bathroom to hearing derogatory comments about her origin, became fuel for her determination. Richard Thompson, the husband, watched in silence but never intervened in his wife's attitudes. 5 years later, in 2023, Dr. Amara Johnson took the oath as a federal judge at the Federal Court of the Central District of California, becoming one of the youngest African-American judges in the state. Destiny reserved a cinematic twist when the Thompson couple was indicted for crimes of racial discrimination against employees, including abusive labor practices and moral harassment. Margaret Thompson turned pale when she saw the woman she had humiliated for years now wearing the robe and presiding over her case. During the trial, Amara maintained professional impartiality, but the irony was not lost. The woman who once denied her dignity was now begging for justice before her. The sentence of 18 months in prison and a fine of $2 million echoed through the courtroom like the sound of justice being served cold. But wait, you haven't heard the most shocking part yet. Because what happened in that Beverly Hills mansion during those 5 years was far more devastating than anyone could imagine, and the true extent of Margaret Thompson's cruelty would only be revealed when FBI agents knocked on her door with a warrant that would expose secrets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Let me take you back to where it all began, to a story that proves sometimes the universe has a sense of justice so perfect it seems scripted by Hollywood itself. It was March 15, 2018, when 23-year-old Amara Johnson first walked through the imposing gates of 1247 Rodeo Drive, carrying nothing but a bucket of cleaning supplies and a heart full of dreams that seemed impossible for someone in her position. She had arrived in Los Angeles just 6 months earlier from Ghana, West Africa, with exactly $437 in her pocket, a student visa, and a burning determination to become a lawyer that her late father had instilled in her since childhood. The Thompson mansion stood like a monument to excess. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city below. Margaret Thompson, 52 years old, stood at the entrance, wearing a designer dress that cost more than Amara would earn in 6 months. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her expression carried the kind of cold superiority that comes from never having to worry about money for a single day of her life. "So, you're the new girl," Margaret said, looking Amara up and down like she was inspecting damaged merchandise. "I hope you understand English better than the last one. I don't have time to repeat myself, and I certainly don't have patience for mistakes. The previous girl lasted exactly 2 weeks before I had to let her go," Margaret continued, circling Amara like a predator sizing up prey. She seemed to think that because she was in America, she was entitled to certain liberties. "I trust you won't make the same mistake." She had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Ghana with a degree in political science and had scored in the 95th percentile on the LSAT before coming to America. She had been accepted to UCLA Law School with a partial scholarship, But the remaining tuition of $68,000 per year might as well have been $68 million for someone in her financial situation. So every morning at 6 a.m., Amara would arrive at the Thompson mansion to clean, and every evening at 7 p.m., she would rush to UCLA for night classes, surviving on 3 hours of sleep and pure determination. But Margaret Thompson saw none of this potential, none of this brilliance. All she saw was what her privileged upbringing had taught her to see: a young black woman who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve. The rules Margaret established were designed not just for efficiency, but for humiliation. Amara was forbidden from using any bathroom except the small one in the basement. She was not allowed to eat anything from the kitchen, not even a glass of water, and was expected to bring her own lunch and eat it outside, regardless of weather. Most cruelly, she was required to enter and exit through the service entrance at the back of the house, ensuring that Margaret's neighbors would never see her coming or going through the front door. "I want to be very clear about something," Margaret said during Amara's first week, her voice dripping with condescension. "This house has hosted senators, celebrities, and business leaders worth billions of dollars. The last thing I need is for anyone to get the wrong impression about the kind of people who work here. You represent my household, and I will not tolerate anything that reflects poorly on my family's reputation." Unlike his wife, who had inherited her wealth and her prejudices, Richard had worked his way up from middle-class roots and remembered what it felt like to be looked down upon. He began to notice things about Amara that his wife was too blinded by bigotry to see. He noticed how she carefully arranged Margaret's books, not just by size but by subject matter, revealing an understanding of literature and philosophy. He observed how she handled Margaret's important documents with the kind of reverence that suggested she understood their significance. Most telling of all, he caught glimpses of legal textbooks in her bag when she thought no one was looking. One evening in late April, as Amara was finishing her work, Richard approached her in the kitchen. "Amara, can I ask you something?" His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "Are you a student?" Here was a woman with the intelligence and drive to pursue one of the most demanding degrees in higher education, scrubbing his wife's floors to pay for the privilege. The irony was so profound, it was almost painful. "Does my wife know about this?" he asked. Amara shook her head. "I didn't think it was relevant to my work here, sir. And I want you to know that if you ever need anything, a reference, a recommendation, anything at all, you can count on my support." As the months passed, Margaret seemed to take perverse pleasure in creating increasingly demeaning tasks for Amara. She would deliberately spill wine on white carpets just before important dinner parties, knowing Amara would have to work frantically to clean the stains. She would rearrange furniture in impossible configurations and then complain loudly to her friends on the phone about how some people couldn't follow simple instructions. The breaking point came in September 2018 during one of Margaret's infamous dinner parties. She had invited 12 of Beverly Hills' most prominent socialites to celebrate the launch of her latest real estate venture, and she wanted everything to be absolutely perfect. Amara had spent the entire day preparing, polishing silver, arranging flowers, ensuring every surface gleamed under the mansion's elaborate lighting. As the guests arrived, Amara was instructed to serve drinks while wearing a specific uniform Margaret had chosen, a black dress with a white apron that looked like something from a 19th century plantation house. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating, and every woman in that room understood exactly what message Margaret was sending. "Ladies," Margaret announced, as Amara moved silently through the room with a tray of champagne, "let me introduce you to my latest find. Amara comes to us from Africa, Ghana, I believe, and she's been absolutely wonderful. So eager to please, so grateful for the opportunity. It really makes you appreciate how blessed we are, doesn't it?" One guest, a woman named Patricia Whitman, whose own domestic worker was standing nearby, leaned toward Margaret with a knowing smile. "Where do you find these girls?" I swear the last 3 agencies I tried sent me the most ungrateful people. They actually had the audacity to ask for weekends off. I make sure Amara understands exactly what's expected of her, don't I, dear? Every humiliation, every casual cruelty, every moment of being treated as less than human was being cataloged and transformed into fuel for the fire that would eventually consume Margaret Thompson's comfortable world. But what happened next would shock everyone in that room. Because Amara Johnson was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when you underestimated someone who had already survived poverty, immigration, and the crushing weight of systemic racism to get where she was. As Margaret continued her performance for her guests, describing Amara's work ethic and gratitude with the kind of language typically reserved for discussing pets, one of the women made a comment that would change everything. "Margaret, darling," said Victoria Ashford, a real estate developer whose own empire was built on questionable practices, "you simply must tell me your secret for keeping help so compliant. I've been through 6 girls this year alone. They all seem to think they're entitled to the same treatment as family. They should be grateful, not demanding. We're providing them with experiences and opportunities they could never achieve on their own." Amara had grown up speaking 4 languages fluently and had been educated at the finest schools Ghana had to offer. She had come to America not because she was escaping poverty, but because she wanted to study international law at one of the world's most prestigious institutions. The cleaning job wasn't desperation, it was determination, a temporary sacrifice in service of a larger goal that none of these women could comprehend. As Margaret continued her performance, describing how she was civilizing her African employee, Amara made a decision that would reverberate through the halls of justice for years to come. She would not just survive this humiliation, she would transform it into something powerful enough to shake the foundations of everything Margaret Thompson believed about the world. But first, she had to get through the next 3 years of law school, and Margaret Thompson was about to make that journey as difficult as possible. The dinner party incident marked the beginning of what Richard Thompson would later describe to FBI investigators as his wife's systematic campaign of psychological warfare. Margaret had tasted the intoxicating drug of public humiliation and found she couldn't get enough. She began inviting friends over specifically to witness her interactions with Amara, turning casual cruelty into entertainment. She would time Amara's cleaning tasks to coincide with social visits, ensuring her friends could witness what she called proper household management. She started requiring Amara to address her as Madam Thompson in front of guests, a title she had never used before, but which created an unmistakable master-servant dynamic that fed her ego. Most cruelly, Margaret discovered Amara's class schedule and began deliberately scheduling extra work during her exam periods. In December 2018, during Amara's first semester finals, Margaret suddenly decided the entire mansion needed to be deep cleaned for a New Year's Eve party she was hosting. "I know this is short notice," Margaret said with false sweetness, "but I'm sure you understand how important this party is for my husband's business. Some sacrifices are necessary when you're trying to better your situation, don't you think?" That night, she sat in her tiny studio apartment and cried for the first time since arriving in America. But Richard Thompson was watching everything, and his discomfort was growing into something deeper and more troubling. He began documenting his wife's behavior, initially out of personal embarrassment, but increasingly out of genuine concern for Amara's well-being. He started a private journal, recording incidents with dates and details, creating what would eventually become crucial evidence in the federal case against his wife. January 15, 2019. Margaret deliberately spilled red wine on the white living room carpet just before Amara's midterm exams. Claimed it was an accident, but I saw her do it intentionally. Made Amara work until 3 a.m. cleaning it. When I suggested hiring a professional service, Margaret said, "Some people need to learn that actions have consequences." When I invited her into the kitchen, Margaret accused me of undermining household discipline and threatened to fire Amara if I encouraged insubordination again. Said book learning wouldn't help her clean toilets any better. The family was asking if she could help with the $15,000 needed for his first year. For Amara, this was everything she had been working toward. The chance to lift her family the same way her education was lifting her. She had been saving every penny possible, living on rice and beans, walking everywhere to save bus fare, buying used textbooks, and wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation. After 18 months of crushing sacrifice, she had managed to save $11,000. Close, but not enough. Desperate, she approached Richard Thompson privately and asked if he knew of any additional work she could take on. Richard was touched by her dedication to her family and immediately offered to lend her the difference, but Amara politely declined, explaining that she needed to earn it herself. "There might be something," Richard said thoughtfully. "My business partner's wife needs help organizing her home office. It's just one weekend, but she's willing to pay well. Would you be interested? Taking outside jobs while you're employed here is a violation of your agreement. If you're not satisfied with your salary, perhaps you should consider whether this position is really right for you." Margaret listened with the kind of cruel smile that suggested she was enjoying every moment of Amara's distress. "That's very touching," Margaret said finally, "but your family problems are not my concern. Your first obligation is to this household. If you can't prioritize your responsibilities here, I'm sure I can find someone who can." Amara felt something break inside her chest, a pain so sharp it was almost physical. She would have to call her family that night and tell them Samuel would have to defer medical school for another year, maybe longer. But Richard Thompson had heard the entire conversation from his home office, and that evening he made a decision that would ultimately lead to his wife's downfall. He knocked on Amara's door as she was preparing to leave and handed her an envelope. Inside was a check for $4,000 and a note that read, "For Samuel's medical school. Some things are more important than household politics. This is between us. Pay me back when you can, if you can. If you can't, consider it a scholarship fund for future African jurists." Because when she discovered her husband's act of kindness 6 months later, her retaliation would be so extreme, so legally questionable, that it would provide federal prosecutors with everything they needed to build a case that would send shockwaves through Beverly Hills' elite social circles. The discovery came in February 2020, when Margaret was going through Richard's business accounts for tax preparation and found the canceled check made out to Amara Johnson. The amount, $4,000, was significant enough to catch her attention. And when she confronted Richard about it, his honest explanation sent her into a rage that neighbors 3 houses away could hear. "You gave her money?" Margaret screamed. "Behind my back? After I explicitly told her she couldn't take outside work? Do you have any idea what this means? Give these people an inch, and they take a mile. She manipulated you, Richard. She played the sob story about her poor family, and you fell for it like a complete fool." Margaret called Amara into the main living room the next morning and presented her with what she called a revised employment agreement. The document required Amara to disclose all sources of income, prohibited her from accepting gifts or loans from any member of the Thompson household, and included a clause requiring her to repay any money she had received under false pretenses, a clear reference to Richard's loan. "Sign this," Margaret demanded, "or clean out your locker and leave immediately." "Thompson," Amara said carefully, "some of these terms may not be legal under California employment law. Perhaps you should have an attorney review. And don't think for a second that I won't make sure every household in Beverly Hills knows exactly what kind of person you really are." But Margaret wasn't satisfied with just humiliating Amara legally. She wanted to break her completely. Over the following months, Margaret implemented what she called enhanced supervision protocols that were designed to be psychologically devastating. She installed security cameras in every room where Amara worked, claiming they were for quality control. but actually using them to monitor and critique her every movement. She began timing Amara's cleaning tasks with a stopwatch, creating arbitrary deadlines that forced her to rush through her work and then criticizing the results. Most cruelly, she began scheduling mandatory performance reviews during Amara's class times, forcing her to choose between her education and her employment. When Amara missed her international human rights law seminar to attend one of these fabricated meetings, Margaret smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Education is important," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false concern. "But so is learning priorities. In the real world, you can't just skip work whenever you feel like attending school. Consider this a valuable life lesson." He began to wonder if he had ever really known Margaret at all, or if her wealth and social position had simply hidden her true nature from him. He started making copies of the security camera footage that showed Margaret deliberately creating messes for Amara to clean, documenting times when his wife forced their employee to work through lunch breaks, and recording conversations where Margaret made explicitly racist comments about Amara's intelligence, background, and future prospects. But the incident that would ultimately end Margaret Thompson's reign of terror was still to come, and it would be so egregiously illegal that even Beverly Hills' most corrupt attorneys would refuse to defend her actions. In September 2020, as Amara entered her final year of law school, Margaret discovered that her employee had been accepted for a prestigious internship with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. The position was unpaid, but would provide invaluable experience and networking opportunities that could launch Amara's legal career. The internship required her to adjust her cleaning schedule by 2 hours twice a week, a minor accommodation that would have no impact on her work quality or the cleanliness of the Thompson mansion. When Amara respectfully requested the schedule change, explaining the professional opportunity it represented, Margaret's response was swift and devastating. "Absolutely not," Margaret said. "Your obligation is to this household, not to some government office that doesn't even pay you. If you can't fulfill your duties here, then perhaps it's time to reconsider your priorities." Margaret listened with the expression of someone watching an amusing but irrelevant performance. "Here's what's going to happen," Margaret said finally. "You're going to decline that internship and focus on the job you're paid to do. Or you're going to find yourself unemployed and explain to your family why you threw away steady income for an unpaid fantasy." In her arrogance and cruelty, she had created a situation that violated federal employment discrimination laws so clearly that even the most conservative prosecutors would have no choice but to act. Preventing an employee from pursuing educational opportunities based on racial prejudice wasn't just morally reprehensible, it was a federal crime. That night, Amara sat in her studio apartment and made the decision that would change both of their lives forever. She picked up her phone and called the FBI's Civil Rights Division to report workplace discrimination and harassment. Then she called Richard Thompson and asked him to meet her for coffee the next morning. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you believe what your wife has been doing to me is legal? And I'm ashamed that I've allowed it to continue as long as I have." "Whatever you need." But the story was far from over, because Amara Johnson's real revenge was still 3 years away, and when it finally arrived, it would be served with the full authority of the United States federal court system. The FBI investigation lasted 8 months and uncovered a pattern of discrimination and harassment so systematic that federal prosecutors called it one of the most clear-cut civil rights cases they had ever seen. Margaret's security camera footage, which she had installed to monitor Amara, instead provided perfect evidence of her own criminal behavior. The cameras had recorded her deliberately spilling substances for Amara to clean, timing her work with a stopwatch while making disparaging comments about her race and intelligence, and explicitly stating that people like her needed to know their place. Richard's journal provided corroborating evidence with precise dates and details, while financial records showed Margaret's attempts to control Amara's income and educational opportunities. But perhaps the most damaging evidence came from Margaret's own friends, who had been present during her numerous displays of power and cruelty. When FBI agents interviewed the women who had attended Margaret's dinner parties, several admitted to feeling uncomfortable with her treatment of Amara, but said they hadn't spoken up because they hadn't wanted to cause social awkwardness. Patricia Whitman, the real estate developer who had praised Margaret's household management techniques, found herself facing her own federal investigation when agents discovered she had been implementing similar practices with her domestic staff. Victoria Ashford was forced to settle a civil lawsuit with 3 former employees for undisclosed amounts that were rumored to be in the millions. Margaret Thompson was indicted on 7 federal charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, employment discrimination, harassment, and intimidation of a witness. Richard filed for divorce the day the indictments were announced, and by February 2021, Margaret found herself alone in her mansion, facing the possibility of decades in federal prison. But while Margaret's world was collapsing, Amara Johnson's was ascending beyond her wildest dreams. Her internship with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office led to a full-time job offer upon graduation. She graduated magna cum laude from UCLA Law School in May 2021, passed the California bar exam on her first attempt, and was hired as an assistant district attorney specializing in civil rights violations. Her first case was prosecuting a Beverly Hills socialite for discrimination against domestic workers, a case that felt like perfect preparation for what was to come. Margaret Thompson's trial began in September 2022, and by then, Amara Johnson had already begun making a name for herself in the legal community. She had won 12 consecutive cases, including 3 high-profile civil rights prosecutions that had garnered national attention. Legal journals were calling her the future of civil rights law, and her professors at UCLA were nominating her for prestigious awards recognizing young attorneys who were making exceptional contributions to social justice. During Margaret's trial, Amara sat in the gallery wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that cost more than Margaret had paid her for an entire month of work. She listened as prosecutor after prosecutor presented evidence of the systematic humiliation she had endured, and she watched Margaret's expensive defense attorneys struggle to explain away behavior that was indefensible under federal law. The irony was not lost on anyone in that courtroom. The woman who had cleaned Margaret Thompson's toilets was now a respected member of the legal profession, while Margaret herself sat at the defendant's table facing the prospect of years in federal prison. Margaret was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, plus 2 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay $2 million in fines and restitution, money that would primarily go to organizations supporting immigrant workers' rights. But the most devastating punishment wasn't the prison sentence or the financial penalties. It was the complete destruction of Margaret's social standing and reputation. Beverly Hills society, which had once courted her approval and competed for invitations to her parties, now treated her as a pariah. The real estate empire she had inherited was damaged by the scandal, and several business partners cut ties rather than be associated with a convicted felon. Richard Thompson, meanwhile, had used the divorce proceedings to liquidate his share of their assets and establish a scholarship fund for African immigrants pursuing legal education in the United States. The Amara Johnson Scholarship would eventually help dozens of young people achieve their educational dreams, creating a legacy that transformed Margaret's cruelty into something beautiful and empowering. But the most poetic justice was still to come, because in January 2023, President Biden nominated Amara Johnson for a federal judgeship on the United States District Court for the Central District of California. At 31 years old, she would become one of the youngest federal judges in American history and the first Ghanaian-American woman to serve on the federal bench. Her confirmation hearings were a celebration of everything Margaret Thompson had tried to destroy. Senators from both parties praised Amara's brilliance, her integrity, and her commitment to justice. Legal scholars testified about her groundbreaking work in civil rights law. Colleagues spoke about her compassion, her work ethic, and her ability to bridge divides and build consensus. Most powerfully, Richard Thompson was called to testify about Amara's character during the years she had worked in his home. Fighting back tears, he told the Senate Judiciary Committee about watching a young woman transform systematic cruelty into unstoppable determination, about witnessing dignity in the face of humiliation, about learning what true strength looked like. "Senators," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I watched Amara Johnson endure treatment that would have broken most people. I watched her sacrifice everything for her education and her family. I watched her maintain her grace and integrity even when she was being treated as less than human." If you want to know what judicial temperament looks like, if you want to understand what justice really means, look at what this woman has accomplished despite every obstacle that was placed in her path. Her swearing-in ceremony was attended by hundreds of supporters, including her mother, who had flown in from Ghana, her brother Samuel, who was now in his final year of medical school, and Richard Thompson, who had become like a father figure to her during the darkest period of her life. But the most symbolic moment came when Amara raised her right hand to take the judicial oath. Standing before her in the crowded courtroom were dozens of domestic workers, cleaning ladies, and service employees who had taken time off work to witness this historic moment. They understood better than anyone what this achievement represented, not just personal success, but proof that dignity and worth weren't determined by the work you did or the uniform you wore. As Judge Johnson spoke the words that would invest her with the authority of the federal judiciary, Margaret Thompson sat in her federal prison cell, watching the ceremony on a small television in the common room. The woman who had once declared that people like her should be grateful for any opportunity was now watching that same woman being sworn in as a federal judge with the power to change lives and shape the future of American justice. The first case assigned to Judge Amara Johnson's docket arrived just 3 weeks after her confirmation, and when she opened the file, she felt the universe's sense of cosmic justice reach its perfect crescendo. Thompson versus Federal Bureau of Prisons was Margaret Thompson's appeal of her conviction and sentencing. Due to a scheduling conflict with another judge and the random assignment system used by federal courts, the case of the woman who had tormented Amara for 5 years had landed on the desk of the Honorable Judge Amara Johnson. Legal ethics required Judge Johnson to recuse herself from any case where she had a personal connection to the parties involved, but this situation presented a unique circumstance. Margaret Thompson had the right to request a different judge, but she would have to admit publicly that she had a personal relationship with Judge Johnson significant enough to create a conflict of interest. Margaret's attorneys, some of the most expensive legal talent money could buy, found themselves in an impossible position. Admitting that their client had a personal relationship with the judge would require them to explain the nature of that relationship, which would inevitably lead to public discussion of Margaret's criminal behavior and the very charges she was trying to appeal. On the other hand, appearing before Judge Johnson meant facing the woman Margaret had systematically humiliated, degraded, and discriminated against for years. The woman she had forbidden from using guest bathrooms was now sitting behind the bench with the power to determine Margaret's fate. After 3 days of deliberation, Margaret's legal team made the decision to proceed with Judge Johnson presiding. They calculated that any attempt to recuse the judge would create more negative publicity than they could afford, and they hoped that Judge Johnson's legal training and professional ethics would ensure a fair hearing regardless of their personal history. They could not have been more wrong about what kind of justice awaited them. The hearing was scheduled for March 15, 2024, exactly 6 years to the day after Amara first walked through the gates of the Thompson mansion. The symbolism was lost on no one, least of all Judge Johnson herself, who had specifically requested that date when reviewing her calendar options. Margaret Thompson entered the federal courthouse wearing a designer suit that couldn't hide the toll that prison and public disgrace had taken on her appearance. Her once perfect hair was now streaked with gray, her face lined with stress and bitterness. She walked with the uncertain gait of someone whose world had been turned completely upside down. Judge Johnson entered the courtroom wearing the black robes that Margaret had once mocked as an impossible dream for someone like her. She carried herself with the quiet authority that comes from having survived the worst humanity can offer and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. When she took her seat behind the bench, the contrast between the two women was stark and unmistakable. "Good morning," Judge Johnson said, her voice calm and professional. "We are here today to consider the appeal filed by Margaret Thompson regarding her conviction and sentencing on federal civil rights violations. Before we proceed, I want to address the unusual circumstances of this case." She had spent countless hours during her imprisonment fantasizing about this moment, imagining the revenge that Amara Johnson might take, the humiliation she might inflict, the sentence she might impose. She had prepared herself for cruelty, for payback, for the kind of vindictive justice that she herself would have dispensed without hesitation. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Johnson continued, "you and I have a history that predates this courtroom. For 5 years, I worked in your home as a domestic employee while pursuing my legal education. During that time, you subjected me to systematic discrimination, harassment, and humiliation that ultimately led to your conviction on federal civil rights charges. I want you to know," Judge Johnson said, looking directly at Margaret, "that despite our personal history, you will receive the same fair and impartial hearing that every defendant deserves under the Constitution of the United States. Your appeal will be judged solely on its legal merits, and my personal experiences will not influence my judicial decision-making." She had expected vindictive justice, the kind of petty revenge that she herself would have pursued. Instead, she was receiving the kind of dignity and fairness that she had never shown to anyone she considered beneath her station. "However," Judge Johnson continued, "I also want to address the broader implications of your case and what it represents for our justice system and our society." She discussed the systematic discrimination that millions of immigrants face every day, and the courage required to pursue education and advancement in the face of overwhelming obstacles. She talked about the responsibility that comes with privilege and wealth, and the moral obligation to treat all human beings with basic respect and dignity. She spoke about the power dynamics that allow some people to systematically humiliate others with impunity, and the importance of legal systems that protect the vulnerable from the predatory behavior of the powerful. Most importantly, she talked about justice, not as revenge or retribution, but as the restoration of balance and the protection of human dignity. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Johnson said as she concluded her remarks, "your actions over those 5 years caused me significant personal and professional harm. You attempted to limit my educational opportunities, you violated my basic human dignity, and you used your wealth and position to systemically discriminate against me based on my race and national origin. However," Judge Johnson continued, "I have reviewed your appeal thoroughly, and I find that your conviction was legally sound and your sentence was appropriate given the severity and systematic nature of your crimes. Your appeal is therefore denied, and your original sentence will stand." But what happened next would demonstrate the true difference between justice and revenge, and why Amara Johnson had become one of the most respected legal minds of her generation. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Johnson said, her voice softening slightly, "I want you to understand something that I hope you will remember during your remaining time in prison and throughout the rest of your life. The work that I did in your home, cleaning, organizing, maintaining your living space, was honest work that deserved respect. The fact that you couldn't see my worth, my intelligence, or my potential says nothing about me and everything about the limitations of your own character and vision. I hope that when you complete your sentence, you will emerge as a better person than you were when you entered. I hope you will use your remaining years to make amends for the harm you caused, not just to me, but to the countless other people who have suffered from the kind of systematic discrimination and cruelty that you practiced. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying anger and resentment would diminish the person I have worked so hard to become. I forgive you because forgiveness is not about excusing your behavior. It's about freeing myself from the burden of your hatred. Margaret Thompson sat in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had tried to destroy and the grace of what she was receiving in return. Richard Thompson, who had been sitting in the gallery, approached the bench after the formal proceedings concluded. "Your Honor," he said, "I want to thank you for showing my ex-wife a level of compassion and dignity that she never showed you. You've demonstrated what true strength and character look like. The woman she had once dismissed as invisible, the employee she had forbidden from using guest bathrooms, the African immigrant she had declared would never amount to anything significant, was now one of the most powerful judicial figures in the American legal system. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this story is what happened after the cameras stopped rolling and the reporters went home to file their stories. Judge Johnson established the Thompson Foundation for Immigrant Education, funded by the restitution money from Margaret's case and additional donations from supporters around the world. The foundation provides scholarships, legal assistance, and mentorship programs for immigrants pursuing education and professional advancement in the United States. Richard Thompson became the foundation's first major donor, contributing $5 million and serving as chairman of the board. "Amara taught me that privilege without purpose is meaningless," he explained. "This foundation ensures that what happened to her becomes a source of opportunity for others facing similar challenges." He credits his sister's sacrifice and determination with inspiring his own academic achievements and his commitment to serving underserved communities. Margaret Thompson served 14 months of her 18-month sentence and was released early for good behavior. She moved to a modest apartment in Santa Monica and began volunteering with organizations that support domestic workers' rights. She has never spoken publicly about her case, but colleagues at the volunteer organizations describe her as quiet, hardworking, and genuinely committed to making amends for her past behavior. Judge Johnson went on to author several landmark decisions protecting workers' rights and immigrant communities. She has been mentioned as a possible Supreme Court nominee and has received honorary degrees from 17 universities, including Harvard Law School, where she was the youngest person ever to deliver the commencement address. But perhaps the most important measure of her success is simpler and more personal. Every morning when Judge Johnson arrives at the federal courthouse, she is greeted by Maria Santos, a young woman from El Salvador who cleans the judicial offices while studying accounting at Los Angeles Community College. Maria always addresses her as "Your Honor," and Judge Johnson always responds with the same words. "Good morning, Maria. How are your studies going?" Inside was a single sentence written in Margaret Thompson's careful handwriting. "Thank you for teaching me what justice really means." And sometimes, late at night when she's working on particularly difficult cases, Judge Johnson thinks about that scared young woman who used to clean toilets in Beverly Hills while dreaming of wearing judicial robes. She thinks about the dignity that sustained her through systematic humiliation, the education that transformed her circumstances, and the justice system that ultimately protected her rights and punished those who violated them. Most of all, she thinks about the thousands of young immigrants who are working in houses and hotels and restaurants across America right now, studying by flashlight after long days of physical labor, dreaming dreams that seem impossible from their current circumstances. She thinks about them, and she uses every tool at her disposal to ensure that the American dream remains accessible to anyone willing to work for it, regardless of where they started or what obstacles they face. Because this story isn't really about revenge or even justice in the traditional sense, it's about the transformative power of education, the dignity of honest work, and the responsibility we all have to treat every human being with basic respect and compassion. It's about a young woman who refused to let systematic cruelty break her spirit, who transformed humiliation into determination, and who proved that the most powerful form of justice isn't punishment. It's becoming the person you were always meant to be, despite every obstacle placed in your path. And it's about the beautiful truth that in America, the woman who cleans your house today might be the judge who protects your rights tomorrow, if we have the wisdom to recognize her potential and the courage to ensure she has the opportunity to fulfill it. The story of Judge Amara Johnson reminds us that dignity, intelligence, and worth aren't determined by social status, wealth, or the color of our skin. They're determined by how we treat others, how we respond to adversity, and whether we use our experiences, both positive and negative, to build a more just and compassionate world. In a society where too many people are judged by their circumstances rather than their character, where systematic discrimination still limits opportunities for millions of Americans, Amara Johnson's journey from domestic worker to federal judge stands as proof that the arc of the moral universe really does bend toward justice, but only when brave individuals are willing to grab that arc and bend it themselves. If this story has inspired you to think differently about the people who serve you, who work in your communities, who may seem invisible but who carry dreams and potential that could change the world, then subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Because every week, we share stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, of underdogs who overcame impossible odds, and of justice that arrived exactly when it was needed most. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their current circumstances don't determine their future possibilities. Share it with someone who has the power to treat others with greater dignity and respect. Share it with someone who needs to believe that justice, even when delayed, can arrive with perfect timing and transformative power. Because the most beautiful truth about America is that it's a place where a young woman from Ghana can arrive with nothing but dreams and determination, and through education, hard work, and the support of good people like Richard Thompson, she can rise to the highest levels of power and use that power to protect others who are vulnerable and marginalized. Judge Amara Johnson's story proves that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. It's becoming the person you were always meant to be, despite every obstacle, every humiliation, and every person who tried to convince you that your dreams were impossible. It's about justice served not with a hammer, but with grace, not with cruelty, but with compassion, not with revenge, but with the kind of dignity that transforms everyone it touches, including those who thought they were beyond redemption. This is why we tell these stories. This is why these examples of human resilience and transformation matter. Because somewhere in America today, there's a young person cleaning offices while studying for the bar exam, serving tables while writing a business plan, or caring for other people's children while pursuing their own education. And maybe, just maybe, that person will see this story and remember that their current job doesn't define their future potential, that systematic cruelty can be transformed into unstoppable determination, and that the American dream is still alive for anyone brave enough to pursue it and wise enough to use their success to lift others up. Subscribe, ring that bell, and remember, the next time you encounter someone in a service job, you might be meeting a future judge, doctor, teacher, or entrepreneur. Treat them accordingly. Because dignity costs nothing to give, but its absence can cost everything to receive. And in a world that often seems dark and divided, stories like Judge Amara Johnson's remind us that justice, compassion, and human dignity will always triumph over hatred, prejudice, and cruelty, as long as there are people brave enough to stand up for what's right, even when the cost is enormous and the outcome is uncertain. That's the America we believe in. That's the future we're building together, one story of transformation at a time.